There you go. Can I remind everyone just to switch off their mobile phones, please, if you don't mind. We have had apologies this morning from Linda Fabiani, and Bill Kidd is attending in her place. And I know that Stuart McMillan will need to leave after the end of the first panel for a private engagement that he needs to be at. Patrick, I think you wanted to make an indication at this stage.
Convener, I don't think this is formally a registrable interest, and I also don't think it will come as a surprise to members of the committee, but just in the interest of transparency, I wanted to put on the record that I'm a member of the advisory board of Yes Scotland. Okay, thank you very much. Well, good morning, gentlemen. This is the fourth of the 5 meetings that we'll have, during which the committee will be taking oral evidence on stage 1 of the referendum bill. Welcome to you as panel witnesses today. From Yes Scotland, we have Dennis Canavan, who's the chair of the advisory board, and Blair Jenkins, OBE, who is the chief executive. And from Better Together, we've got Blair McDougall, campaign director, and Craig Harrow, the director. I understand that both Blair Jenkins and Craig Harrow would like to make short opening statements, and I think Dennis wants to give us a minute after they've both had a chance to say their piece. So, Blair Jenkins, can I start with you, sir?
Thank you, Convener. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning. As you say, Dennis will talk a little bit about the role of the Advisory Board of Yes Scotland. Very briefly, we are delighted to be taking part in this process. We would share the aspiration, I know, of everyone around the table, every member of the committee, that we have a very, very good referendum process. We are acutely aware of the historical importance of this for Scotland and the Scottish people. We are determined to run the kind of positive campaign that will engage and enthuse people in Scotland, and I'm sure that aspiration again is shared by all members of the committee and by both campaigns. So we're very pleased to be part of this process, and I'll hand over to Dennis for his remarks.
Convener, thank you for inviting us. I chair the advisory board of Yes Scotland. The advisory board consists of about a dozen members from various backgrounds, such as politics, the business community, media and entertainment. Yes Scotland is a very broad-based, inclusive organisation, and that is reflected in the membership of our advisory board, which includes people of different political parties and people who are not members of any political party at all. We are more of an advisory committee rather than an executive committee. Our job is to advise the chief executive and the management team on matters regarding the Yes Scotland campaign. So I very much look forward to this evidence session.
Dennis, thank you. Craig?
Thank you very much, Convener. Many thanks to you and to this committee for inviting my colleague Blair McDougall and me along this morning. On behalf of Better Together, we welcome the opportunity to give evidence to this committee. The rules and regulations governing any electoral contest are, of course, very important, and this is of heightened importance in a once-in-a-lifetime referendum on an irreversible decision like dissolving a 300-year-old union. We all have a duty to ensure that we deliver a result which is not only fair but seen to be fair. For our part, we have strived to act in a transparent manner. We supported the involvement of the Electoral Commission and their rules as a matter of principle from the outset. Better Together was the first campaign to release details of our donors, and we've decided not only to meet the normal standards of electoral law, but to go further by banning any foreign donations to our campaign. Better Together considers the sensible recommendations put forward by the Electoral Commission to be a big step forward in ensuring a fair referendum rules, and as you'd expect, we've followed the discussions of this committee and are pleased that the work continues to ensure that the process of this referendum is properly scrutinised. We've been particularly interested in the discussions about permitted participants, and for us it's important that dummy organisations are not established, but also that campaigning groups account for expenditure properly in the regulated period. For our part, we want to ensure clarity about which groups are formal accounting units of our organisation. That way, regulators and the media will know which organisations are part of Better Together for the purposes of recording expenditure and which are not, and so would be considered as other participants. In simple terms, we are operating one accounting unit. In other words, our women's LGBT, rural, youth, business, trade unions groups won't be setting up separate bank accounts or separate funding vehicles, and we're happy to discuss this or any other issue with the committee today. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Craig. Can I just begin the session this morning by asking both campaign groups about an issue that has arisen during our evidence-taking session. That's the situation that arose in Wales, where only one body decided to find itself as a designated organisation. So a very simple question, I think, in terms of that, to you both. Do you intend to apply for designation as a designated organisation status? And are there any circumstances you envisage not applying for such a status?
We will certainly be applying to be the designated campaign organisation campaigning for the yes vote, and in fact we would welcome early designation as the official yes campaign organisation.
Absolutely. I can't envisage any circumstances where we wouldn't seek to be the designated official organisation. And in fact, Blair and I were outside just talking about our wish to have early designation if possible, just so that everybody has clarity about where both the campaigns stand.
You both talked about early designation. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
I think in theory you would be designated a short period in time before the start of the regulated period in June. I think the Electoral Commission have expressed an interest in looking at whether early designation would be possible. So sometime, I presume, earlier in 2013 than that. From my point of view and from Better Together's point of view, almost the sooner the better in terms of designation, because, as I say, it gives you a certainty as to what your status is.
Just to add to that, I think the Electoral Commission do have their own processes to go through, and we have to respect those. But subject to going through due process, then I think as soon as possible and the earlier the better would be the appropriate phrases.
Okay, just to clarify one thing, Blair, for the record, Blair McDougall, for the record purposes, you said 2013. I think you meant 2014.
Yes, apologies.
Particularly when people are scribing behind you as well.
We are unaware of any other competitor organisation, so I don't see any problems regarding us being the sole designated body.
Okay, well, I need to put that on the record because there were issues of concern raised as part of the evidence-taking session, particularly the experience in Wales, but I'm glad you've clarified it. James.
Okay, thank you, Convener, and thank you for coming along this morning to share your evidence with us. Clearly, note your earlier comments that, you both intend to be the lead organisations for each side of the argument, and I think that makes great sense. That, therefore, puts great responsibility on you in terms of, how you, not just how you conduct the campaigns, but how you account for your expenditure. Clearly, we have a limit of 1.5 million for each lead organisation, and within that, you're going to have to account for each expenditure over £200. So that's clearly a major operation for each campaign. So can I ask what accounting policies and practices you're going to put in force to ensure that that is done correctly and in compliance with the regulations?
McDougall, you want to start?
So the steps we've taken is to try to ensure that there's clarity about which organisations are actually part of Better Together for accounting purposes, and so that there's then clarity about which organisations aren't. Clearly the issues around permitted participants and coordination arise out of an organisation being separate from you for the purposes of the overall amount of money that they're allowed to spend, but then being coordinated with you. So what we're trying to do is, notwithstanding the cross-party nature of things and the individual parties having their own spending limits, is to try to give a clarity about which organisations are actually formally part of Better Together. So as Craig said a moment ago, we're trying to ensure that the various organisations which are politically autonomous are not separate in terms of accounting, because what we don't want to get to is a situation where the regulated period, X thousand pounds have been spent in our name that we can't account for, because, as you say, I think my understanding as well is that every individual item of expenditure over £200 has to be accounted for eventually. So I think it's useful to be clear as to what Better Together expenditure actually is. and who is in our view, permitted to be spending that money on our behalf.
Yeah, I think the key principle here is one of transparency, and that people understand the difference between the official campaigns and other bodies which may or may not have a view on either side of the argument. And there are, for instance, on the pro-independence side of things, if I can point to a couple of examples, there is a group called Women for Independence, which is campaigning for a yes vote, but they are not formally part of the Yes Scotland campaign. Recently, for instance, a business group has set up Business for Scotland, which is also advocating a yes vote in next year's referendum, but is not connected to us. So we would make a distinction between what the official campaign spends, Yes Scotland spends, and any activity that's happening with other organisations which may be part of the independence movement, but are not formally part of Yes Scotland. But we are very well and expertly advised in this by people with a great deal of experience.
Okay, I want to come back to some of the individual groupings who are close or aligned to each of your organisations that you've mentioned. But just to get a feel for this, let me give you a kind of practical example, and if you can demonstrate how the expenditure is controlled and recorded. Just say that Yes Forfar and Better Together Forfar, both decide that they want to spend £500 on leaflets in a campaign weekend. How's that going to be authorised? How's the expenditure going to be authorised? How's it going to be paid for and recorded?
So we, in the guidance and the advice and the day-to-day support that we give to local groups in that example, is pretty clear that we don't expect them to be setting up local bank accounts and that sort of thing. Now, to the best of my knowledge, they're not doing that at the moment. If they are, then we would take action to try to sort that. So if they wish to spend £500 on leaflets, that money would have to come from our central bank account, and therefore would appear in our accounts within the regulated period as an item of expenditure. Now, they could, in theory, have a bank account and could be doing that separately without our knowledge. But as I say, what we're trying to do is to ensure that those individual groups are not doing that. And at the moment, to the best of our knowledge, they're not.
Jenkins?
Yes, Scotland's in a similar position in as much as local yes groups, of which there are now more than 170, have not been encouraged to open their own bank accounts, and any expenditure at a local level during the regulated period would have to be totalled up within the national spending by Yes Scotland. So we're very clear that it would have to be clear mechanisms for being aware of any spend that's locally incurred by an official Yes group.
So it's similar to Better Together, you've got one central bank
Yes.
account, and all the expenditure and authorisation is run from the central organisation.
Yes.
Right. Okay, can I just then look at some of the associated organisations? My understanding of the Better Together position is that you have a number of groups who are working with you, but they're not separate organisations. And any expenditure that they incur, has to come through Better Together. Is that, have I got that correct?
The situation of those groups would be identical to local geographic groups that we've established. So we ask them not to have separate bank accounts. So, for example, through our rural work, an individual wanted to specifically support financially the work that they were doing, rather than donating directly to that group, they donated to us, and we ring-fenced that money in order to ensure that there is that certainty of who's accounting for that. But none of those groups, as I say, while they will be politically autonomous and distinct in organisational terms and in accounting terms, they are in-house.
Yeah. Now, in terms of Yes Scotland, if I picked you up correctly, Mr Jenkins, you gave a couple of examples, including Women for Independence, and what you seem to be outlining is that although they are supportive of the objectives of your campaign, they're separate from the campaign. So they would, am I right in saying that they would come under the remit of permitted participants and would not be included under the Yes Scotland umbrella?
Well, yes, my assumption, I haven't asked him this question, my assumption is that they would wish to register in that way. So it was a decision that group took, not formally to affiliate to Yes and to be formally part of Yes Scotland. There are a mixture of groups, I think, as with the Better Together campaign. There are a mixture of groups, some of whom have chosen to be formally affiliated and others who have chosen not to be. I think, in terms of the overall concerns of the committee in this area, I would imagine most of those groups, and Women for India is a clear example, would not in themselves, I think, be incurring large sums of expenditure. I think perhaps a greater area of concern, I'm sure we'll move on to, is the scope within the limits allowed for permitted participants to spend rather large sums of money. So I don't think it's these more ad hoc groups of enthusiasts and supporters who are organising themselves in a fairly low-cost and basic way. I don't think that's a concern in terms of where the financial impact on the campaign is felt. I think it's much more, if there is a potential concern, I think it would be around a number of entities which register and are either able or intending to spend up to £150,000. I think that's the area where people would wish to keep a very close eye on who and what is getting involved to that extent.
Just to be clear, but you'll be aware of the committee's concerns around permitted participants and £150,000 each permitted participant is able to spend, and you know that mechanism not being used for a number of other organisations to use surplus funds from the lead campaign organisation. You've given a number of examples this morning, and you've been quite clear that they're going to be separate from Yes Scotland. Have you not given? Has there been any consideration given to keeping them under them all under the one umbrella, so that the expenditure can be more tightly controlled and authorised, and so that there are no concerns that loopholes are being used in order to channel surplus funds into these permitted participant organisations?
Well, we would not be channeling. I mean, I don't expect to be in a position of having surplus funds. I would have to say. I think we'll be. I think both campaigns will find themselves very actively fundraising to try to meet the limits which have been set. But I think it is up to some extent, it's up to organisations themselves who are campaigning on either side of the debate to decide whether they wish to be formally under the umbrella of each campaign. And I think the rules and regulations are fairly clear as to when organisations are deemed to be acting together or in concert with the official campaign organisations. So my concern would not be, as I say, for groups like Women for India or those activist type groups, enthusiastic supporter groups. I think it would be, the concern would be much more about parties coming in at a very high level of expenditure and how many of those did come in.
There is also, Mr. Kelly may be interested to know, an organisation called Labour for Independence. I doubt very much if they'll be getting any money from the Labour Party, although I'm sure that they would welcome that. They may, I mean, it's up to them. I haven't discussed this with them, but it would be open to them to register as permitted participants, in which case they would be allowed to spend a maximum of £150,000. But they may decide to come in within the Yes Scotland umbrella, and if that is the case, if we give such an organisation any money, then we will make every effort to ensure that that is transparent.
Just to be clear, in terms of these separate organisations, the examples that you've given, what discussions then have Yes Scotland had with them as to whether they come under the formal Yes Scotland banner or whether they operate separately?
Well, it depends on. It's been a different type of discussion with different entities. Some have not approached us at all to talk about whether or not they're simply up and running, as it were. Others, I mean, Women for India is an example where there was a discussion with them about whether they would formally be part of Yes or not. I think sometimes people like the freedom, if you like, to depart from the campaign narrative and to make their own case in their own way, which I think is entirely legitimate and entirely proper if they wish to do that.
One thing you said there, Blair Jenkins, in terms of your response, you talked about the permitted participant sum, 150,000, if I got this right, being a rather large sum. What did you mean by that? Were you suggesting that sum was maybe too high?
Well, as you probably know, Convener, I mean, we recommended a rather lower sum be adopted for permitted participants. £50,000 was the sum that we proposed. We obviously accept the outcome of the deliberations of the Electoral Commission, and we now accept that this is the limit that will be in place. You can do a lot with £150,000 in a referendum campaign. So, provided everyone understands the potential for, and I think this will be much more to do with organisations rather than individuals, provided everyone understands that that is a lot of money in campaign terms. And if you had a large number of entities, for instance, coming from outside Scotland, putting in those sorts of sums of money into the referendum campaign, I think that would raise legitimate questions.
Stuart Maxwell and then Tavish Scott.
Yeah, thanks. I want to explore some of this issue that we dealt with last week, and we are again this morning, on the permitted participants and the possible establishment of a variety of organisations with this £150,000 limit. Can I start with Better Together? Can I do? Because I wasn't absolutely clear from the answers you gave to James Kelly about what exactly your intention is and the way that you're establishing your organisation. Is it the case that you will have Better Together and all groups will be under that umbrella and they'll all be within the £1.5 million expenditure? Or will there be separate groups which will be classified as permitted participants, so that the £1.5 million plus the £150,000 each group?
What we're trying to be, so there's two elements to this issue. One is about the overall level of expenditure, and I understand that the concern does circle around this £150,000 figure, but actually in legal terms you only have to spend £10,000 to trigger the permitted participant requirement. But the other issue is about accounting for expenditure. So what we're saying is that if you are an organisation that we are coordinating with, because the issue here is about coordination between these dummy organisations and the umbrella campaigns, if you are coordinated with us, you will be in-house, so that there is no risk of us falling foul of that coordination issue.
Sorry, I thought for a minute earlier on you were saying that you wouldn't be having these separate organisations, permitted participants. Everything would be under Better Together, but you're not saying that.
What I'm saying is that all the organisations that we coordinate with, so our trade union organisation, our women's organisation, our LGBT organisation, they will be politically autonomous, but organisationally and financially, they will be part of the central Better Together bank account. And if there are other organisations which spring up, there are not ones which spring to mind at the moment, which are outside of that grouping and need to have that permitted participant status, then fine. But what we're saying is that given that the thing that triggers this as a legal issue is the issue of coordination, that those organisations which we coordinate with at the moment certainly are in-house.
Sorry, I'm just going to push this one last time. Just, is it your expectation that there will be separate no campaigns which are permitted participants but not part of the umbrella organisation?
It's not my anticipation that that will be the case, no.
Blair Jenkins, if I could ask you, what's the situation with Yes Scotland in terms of either the coordination element between Yes Scotland as the designated organisation and other participants which are under that umbrella, and also the same question on the issue of separate permitted participants who are supporting the Yes campaign?
Well, I think Mr McDougall has covered the point in more or less the same way I would. I think if there's any intention to coordinate in terms of how you're campaigning and there's joint funding of things, that sort of thing, and I think that the position is fairly clear on what constitutes cooperation and coordination. If with a group we intended to be integrated to that level to any extent, then they have to come under the funding limit for Yes Scotland as the designated campaign organisation. I would expect there will be some entities which will choose to be permitted participants. Some actually, I suspect, I mean, I mentioned Women for Indy. I doubt if Women for Indy will be a permitted participant, because I doubt if they're intending to spend £10,000. So, I suspect they will not be brought under that particular aspect of the process. A group like Business for Scotland potentially, I imagine, might meet that trigger point and therefore might have to separately register as a permitted participant. I'm not as yet, I'm just searching my brain, I'm not as yet aware of anyone else, any other entity that's come along, or certainly that's made themselves known to us, which would be at that level of expenditure and which would be a permitted participant.
Do either group have concerns about the discussion we had last week with the Electoral Commission on the issue or the possibility of, we'll call them dummy organisations, but multiple organisations being established and being funded by an individual or individuals or groups effectively to make use of that rather big envelope of £150,000 per permitted participant? I know it's up to £150,000, but do any of you have concerns about the possibility of that happening?
I would be concerned if it did happen. I think that there's two aspects to the guidance that the Electoral Commission will have to draft. One is to make the guidance so strong in terms of coordination with that type of organisation that it deters us from coordinating with them behind the scenes. Part of the reason we've organised ourselves in the way we have at the moment is that the guidance as previously written about coordination is incredibly stringent. I mean, it's almost difficult to read it and to see how you wouldn't fall foul of coordination rules, even as a cross-party campaign, you know, between Yes Scotland and say the SNP, or between ourselves and the three parties under our umbrella. So I'm pretty confident that the guidance will be so strong as to deter us from coordinating with them. But that's not to say that someone won't go and do that. And I think if there was large numbers of people doing that, I think it would be a concern. But I think, as the Electoral Commission said, it's difficult to see how you prevent that while still maintaining, you know, people's right to free speech.
Yeah, I think it is a concern, and it remains to be seen whether that materialises as we move into the final part of the referendum campaign. I think, given the position that Better Together have taken on donations from other parts of the UK, there's been an encouragement, if you like, for people out with Scotland to become actively and financially involved on the no side of the campaign. I think, given that there's that implicit or explicit encouragement for people who are against Scottish independence in other parts of the UK to get materially and financially involved in the campaign, I would be surprised if there were not organisations and entities in other parts of the UK. I would be surprised if they didn't come in with a level of funding for the no campaign as we move into the final period of the referendum.
On the yes side, I cannot envisage any of the organisations with whom we are in contact at present having as much as £150,000 to spend. But at the end of the day, it's up. I mean, some of these organisations are fairly autonomous, with strong-willed people in the leadership, but it's up to them really to decide whether or not they want to register as permitted participants. You know, we cannot dictate to them, but on our side, I don't see it as a huge problem. But I will be watching the other side carefully to see what emerges.
I think the other thing that was obvious from the evidence that came from the Electoral Commission is the time that we have between the poll, between the regulated period, gives us time to get those things absolutely right.
Right. Okay, Stuart. Tavish, I think you've got another supplementary in this area.
Thank you, Convener. Just a couple of supplementaries. Just for the record, Mr Jenkins, your campaign takes donations from overseas as well, doesn't it?
It takes, what it does take is sums of money below £500.
Yeah, but that's a donation from overseas.
As you know, Tavish, the legislation does not treat anything below £500 as a donation.
Yeah, but you made a statement earlier on, so just for the record.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. No, that wasn't the point I wanted to ask, Convener. It was actually about Mr Jenkins' earlier mention of Business for Scotland, which I think he's mentioned twice now in evidence to the committee in response to Mr Kelly. And he said, if I got his quote correctly, he said it was not connected to us. Given the Electoral Commission's advice to this committee last week, what's your understanding of what not connected means?
Well, I think Business of Scotland will have its own plans and its own agenda. I don't think, for instance, it's the only part of its remit as an organisation, as I understand it. And it was actually launched while I was out of the country, so I haven't sat down and had this detailed discussion with them. But I think they're on a broader agenda than just the referendum of next year. I think they want to promote a business agenda, if you like, as well as the independence agenda. So they will conduct their own membership drive, their own activity, issue their own statements, I'm sure. They're not clearing those with me. They're not coordinating with us in that sense. So I think Business of Scotland is an entity in its own right. But as far as I can see, it's certainly going to be campaigning on the yes side of the argument.
and I'm asking this question of both campaigns, do you both have a view on how tight this Electoral Commission advice should be drawn in respect of this phrase connections?
In the past, it has been drawn in an incredibly stringent manner. So stringent that we have concerns which we're discussing with the Electoral Commission about what it means, whether it's actually logical to have such stringent controls on the relationship between a party within a cross-party campaign and a central kind of cross-party campaign. But I think it has to be stringent for those organisations which lay outside of the umbrella campaigns, because I know that the discussion about dummy organisations has circulated around this anticipation that wealthy individuals will want to set up organisations so they can spend £150,000, but actually, legally, it's just £10,000 to trigger this legal requirement to account for expenditure. And that's why, again, as I say, we've taken that view that if you are coordinated with us in any way, in any serious way, that you come in-house.
I think just to add to that point, Tavish, we have been in dialogue, informal dialogue, for some time now with the Electoral Commission, and I would expect to be in a fairly ongoing dialogue with them on this and other areas. And my experience of them to date would be that they will certainly keep us very mindful of these things and will give us very clear advice on what is and is not permissible. I think in the spirit of transparency that was referred to earlier, I'm sure both campaigns would wish to observe all of the conditions attached to this process.
Thank you, that's very helpful. And my one other supplementary in respect of the forfeit for independence example that Mr. Kelly was picking up earlier on. Again, Mr. Jenkins, just for the record, did I hear you correctly when you said that the spending in respect of forfeit for independence or forfeit for better together or what either side it might be, was during the regulated period? What about expenditure that takes place between, or may already be taking place between now and the start of the regulated period? Do you have a view on that?
Well, we're not, as you know, we're not reporting expenditure before we get to the regulated period. What we're reporting is donations. We are reporting the level of donations received during that time, which is so it's a different framework, if you like, operating before we get to the regulated period.
The fact that you mentioned, I think, that 100 and odd organisations have been set up across Scotland. I know the one at home, and they're certainly spending money, and that's okay. I mean, that's going to go on, and there's no expenses limit on any of that expenditure for either campaign between now and the start of the regulated period, is there?
That is correct. That is sufficient.
Yeah. Thank you.
Response to that as well.
Similarly, I think it's difficult to control expenditure. What we are seeking to control is, if you like, the through control of bank accounts and through control of accounting, to try and make sure that, as far as possible, those organisations aren't creating a sort of distinct personality in financial terms.
I think I need to move this on a bit, Craig. So just remind, I've still got other people who want to have supplementaries in this area, and we've only really got around donations that have permitted participants at this stage, and there's other ground we need to cover. But Patrick, I know, has got a supplementary, I think, in this area as well.
Thank you, Convener. It's very brief. It's just that, you know, witnesses and members have both used the term dummy organisations, and I'm a wee bit uncomfortable with it. The rules do allow permitted participants who are not part of the Yes Scotland or Better Together organisations at all. Obviously, there'll be an issue about everybody wanting to make sure everyone's complying with the rules. Can you just clarify for both campaigns, are you content with those rules? Do you accept that the rules as laid out in the bill around permitted participants are appropriate, or would you be asking for any change that would prevent separate organisations from registering and legitimately campaigning?
I think we're content with the intention behind it, but as I said a moment ago, we're in discussions with the Electoral Commission about the written guidance that they give, just so that, I mean, for example, at the moment, if Patrick Harvey, as a Yes Scotland board member, is involved with setting Yes Scotland strategy, the guidance is almost written as if, when you then go to run the Green Party campaign, that you have to forget what you know about the Yes Scotland strategy and make sure that they don't connect. And there's a risk slightly, I think, within the cross-party nature of the campaigns that we have, that you get into slightly ridiculous situations there. But in terms of, I guess the reason I use the term dummy organisation is that I would sort of draw a distinction between the types of organisations that you're talking about and the fear of rich individuals with no real grassroots support coming in and setting up £150,000 funding vehicles. But the guidance has yet to be written on that, and we would seek to engage with the Electoral Commission on that.
The position is fairly loose in terms of, very loose in terms of who can come in and register and then proceed to spend large sums of money. I agree that it would seem pretty difficult to limit or put any kind of a controlling framework in place as to who is an improper or a proper organisation to come in and be a registered participant. So other than the funding limit issue, which I mentioned earlier, I think we accept that we are where we are, and that is how the position will apply to permitted participants.
Thank you.
Supplementary as well, is it? Because it's been clarified. Patricia? I'm trying to move on from this area.
Yep, not a problem. I'll be very quick. And you'll excuse me for not knowing the answer to this. And I'm sorry if it sounds one-sided, but I know the answer on one side and I don't know the answer on the other, so forgive me. But Mr Canavan mentioned earlier on the advisory board for the Yes campaign, and I just wondered if you could perhaps elucidate what the membership of that advisory board consists of.
I think I have the total list here. As I said, we consist of people from the world of politics, people from a business background, people from entertainment. This is not a comprehensive list, but we have Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh, who is a lawyer, producer, actress and mother of 4. We've got Aileen C. Smith, who needs no introduction, I'm sure, famous actress and comedienne. Pat Kane, musician, hue and cry, commentator on various things. Sarah Jane Walls, a director of the Residence Glasgow, and she's a businesswoman, wife and mother of 2 young girls. She's been in the fitness industry for more than 12 years. Got Dan McDougall, a Highlander and proud of it, born in a 9-acre Sutherland croft, educated at Dornoch Academy and now Chief Executive of McDonald Estates. Got Colin Fox, who is well known, I'm sure, to everybody in this room as a former member of the Scottish Parliament and national spokesperson of the Scottish Socialist Party. We have Nicola Sturgeon, who again needs no introduction, and Andrew Fairley, who is a Perth man and patron of the eponymous restaurant Andrew Fairley within the Glen Eagles Hotel and Resort. And we've also got a young lady called Ellie, who is our youth representative, and she gives us very useful information regarding the feelings of young people on various issues. Have I missed anybody out, Blair? Is there
Patrick Harvey, but
my apologies, Patrick. Yes.
In the corner. You'd never know.
I said at the start it was not a comprehensive list. Patrick, yeah.
It's absolutely clear why Patrick didn't need to be mentioned. We all know who Patrick is. And Ellie Coplinger happens to be a constituent of mine, so she needed no introduction to me. But I thank Mr Canavan for that. That was helpful.
This is the last one in this area, because we really must move on to other areas.
It's really a question, going back to something Blair McDougall mentioned a moment ago in an answer to our question. He seemed to qualify coordination by inserting the adjective serious, if there had been any serious coordination. And in that context, and perhaps looking at the issue of permitted participants from a more realistic perspective, one that is more likely perhaps to pan out in the course of the campaign, if, for example, a well-known Conservative no figurehead came along and he had 150,000 to dish out, would he be encouraged to give it to the Better Together campaign, or would he be encouraged to just go ahead and become a permitted participant? And equally, if any single trade union, I think that happened a couple of weeks ago, indicated that they intended to campaign as a union for a no vote, similarly, would they be under the umbrella of Better Together, or would they be a permitted participant? It's just not very clear to me in terms of the discussion thus far.
To be clear, so the legal issue here is triggered, is my understanding, by coordination. So what we're saying is that if you coordinate with us, and by serious coordination I mean coordinated in a way which would fall foul of the guidance that the Electoral Commission will draft, then we would seek to account for your expenditure centrally through our single accounting system and bank account. Your point on outside permitted participants, if we were to encourage an individual like that to go and set up, Edinburgh Citizens Against Independence, for example, that would be coordination. So we would fall foul of that. In terms of business and unions, the Electoral Commission, specifically does talk about those sorts of individuals. Now they obviously have their own legal and regulatory framework in addition to what the Electoral Commission will say. But clearly, if they spend more than £10,000, they'll have to be permitted participants. In a way, it becomes an issue for us if we coordinate with them. And that, again, is why we are saying that those organisations which would meet the Electoral Commission guidance definition of coordination would be in-house.
Right, I'm going to move on to another area. Bill Kidd, I know you wanted to explore a separate issue in the bill.
Thank you, Convener. Welcome, gentlemen. Yeah, it is separate, but I hope it does follow on, actually, because you're not raising this money for the sake of a bank account. You're actually using it for something at the end of the day. So, on that basis, in terms of the referendum bill, I may ask both organisations if you're happy in terms of the provisions laid out in the bill. I think it's under Schedule 4, which would relate to your expenditure, and in terms of referendum broadcasts, mail shots, newspaper inserts, such things as this. Are you happy with the provisions as are laid out? Do you see that there may be problems in terms of how you will actually sort of use these outlets in order to encourage people to vote for your particular direction?
Broadly speaking, we're happy with it. I mean, in terms of free mail shots and things like that, we'll certainly have no problem using it. But in the way that both the bill is set out and the guidance the Electoral Commission has set out so far, we're broadly happy.
I think the one area I might pick up on is broadcasts during the control period, during the final stages of the referendum campaign. The suggestion has been that there may be as few as 2 allocated to each campaign during the 16 weeks of the regulated period. My view would be, and I know this will still be subject to discussion and debate, my view very much would be that it would be appropriate to have a larger number over such a prolonged final period of the campaign. And I would have thought a number something like 4 might be a more appropriate number over that period of time. But this is something we'll need to engage in discussion with.
Just follow up on that then. If on the particular on referendum broadcasts, as I think they will be termed, in terms of participants and in terms of expenditure on these, have you given any thought to these at all as yet? Because obviously these can be highly professional jobs. I mean, they'll all be professional, but they can be glossy Hollywood style things, or they can be something which is much more akin to getting a message across in a more innovative manner. And that would actually incur costs, I should imagine, on the basis that you are limited in terms of the amount of money that you have as a central organisations. Would you be thinking that more money should actually be channelled towards referendum broadcasts than the sort of standard, leaflet mail shot through doors and such like? Or, I mean, I don't want to dig too deeply into your plans, but would you believe that agreement will have to be made between both organisations and the Electoral Commission for how the money is actually spent when it comes to broadcasts such as this?
Are you suggesting there should be a limit in terms of how much is spent on the broadcast? Is that what you're saying?
Well,
within the 1.5 million limit?
Well, indeed, but I'm actually just wondering in terms of an agreement between all participants as to how the money should be spent on the limited number of broadcasts that you will actually have, because it won't be as if, as Blair Jenkins has said, you won't have a dozen each or something like this. You will have a limited number, and would you be willing and would you encourage the idea that you would cooperate with each other across that in order to limit the expenditure which actually would be incurred?
I mean, my sense is, I mean, you know, more airtime is always welcome. I think you're right to point out the fact that you know, particularly kind of high production PPB is an expensive thing. What I'd say though is that I think it's been some years since party political broadcasts have been used solely as through the medium of the you know, the 3-minute slot that you get. It tends to be now, you know, YouTube advertising and social media sharing with these sorts of things. But with, you know, with anything, there's an opportunity cost to doing anything within a campaign. You've got to make a judgment as to which way you go. I've been involved in perhaps showing my Labour background. I've been involved in enough campaigns where budgets have been limited to know that even with a limited budget, you can fill a 2-minute slot.
Yeah, I doubt very much if you could get to a point where there's agreement between two campaigns on the production costs that they would incur in association with the broadcast. However, in relation to your question, I can confirm that ours will be professional and innovative.
Yeah, okay. Well, may I just finally ask on that then, actually, in terms of what is actually in the bill, it really is quite thin from my viewing in terms of what it would suggest that you're allowed to do in terms of the message that you're putting across. Obviously, there will be, you will have to stay within the law in terms of how you refer to other people, or etc. But it really doesn't actually, from my reading in section 4 of in Schedule 4 of the bill, actually give much guidance as to what you have to actually do, as opposed to what you might want to do. So, are you in more talks in terms with the Electoral Commission over how you will actually proceed with that?
Not at the moment. Is your question about whether we would choose to use the airtime or not?
Well, it's not. No, it's just you know, there are rules here, most of which seem to relate to central and local government and how they might actually operate within publications, etc. And it does mention delegated organisation, but it's very, very small. It doesn't actually expand on that. We are aware that the organisations Better Together and Yes Scotland are the two major sort of proponents who are going to be taking part in this referendum. And it does seem quite thin in the actual bill, and I was wondering if there were discussions, talks, or even thoughts as to how that might be filled out to give you both guidelines, which will mean that neither side feels uncomfortable with what the other side is doing.
Well, I think more guidance is always welcome, whether it comes from the Electoral Commission or from broadcasters or whoever.
Yeah, I think the reality is that any set of guidelines for an electoral event is usually more likely to be telling you the things that you're not able to do, rather than, you know, what you can do, as it were. So what's stipulated is what's not permissible, much more than what is permissible. I go back to, I suppose, what I said at the beginning, Bill, that I think what people will really be looking for is the way in which the two campaigns conduct a campaign, that the campaigns are conducted in a positive way, with courtesy and respect shown between the two campaigns. I've always believed, even before I knew I was going to be involved in the Yes Scotland campaign, I've always believed that the process we go through and the way in which Scotland conducts this debate is very, very important. So it's not just the outcome, of course, is what the two sides are keenly contesting. But I think the process and the fact that the people of Scotland feel they've gone through a very good process is hugely important.
I think the tone is important, but I think also it was one of the points that was raised by Willie Sullivan, which is about the fact that referendums are run by elites, essentially, and I think we have to make sure that this referendum in particular, we get to as many people of Scotland, and both sides, I'm sure, share that ambition, that we make sure that we're innovative and creative in terms of the way that we approach things.
Thank you very much.
Can I add, you know, whatever additional guidelines may be issued, we shall certainly work within the law, the rules, the guidelines and the expenditure limits to ensure that professionally produced programmes are put out to inform the general public and to get our message across. And, you know, on our advisory board, as you can see from the names that I've previously mentioned, we have people who are experienced in media productions, etc. So we are confident that we can get our message across by that means.
Thank you very much for that.
I've had no indications of any supplementaries in this area, so I'm going to move on to Rob Gibson, who had issues that he wanted to raise as well.
Yes, thanks, Convener. Good morning. You've had quite a lot of engagement with the Electoral Commission. Be quite interested to know, what engagement you've had on matters of awareness, and information, which they have a role to play, and you have a role to play. What's been your experience in that regard?
Well, certainly in discussions we've had up to this point with the Electoral Commission, they very much quite properly see it as part of their role to build awareness of the referendum, to encourage participation, to encourage people who are either not on the electoral register to register, or people who are but don't vote to vote. From a Yes Scotland point of view, we are absolutely focused on getting a very, very high turnout. That, for all sorts of reasons, I think is hugely important. So we will be involved with the Electoral Commission, and I'm sure with the Better Together, in any initiative which is aimed at building voter awareness, building public awareness, and ensuring a high level of participation. And separately from that, we obviously will be doing our own things as a campaign to try and secure greater participation and turnout.
I just echo what Blair said. I mean, I think few people in Scotland will not now be aware that there's a referendum coming. So I think actually the challenge for the Electoral Commission is about those process issues. So making sure that we don't have a situation where people are, in a very high turnout election where people may not have voted before, who may not have been registered before, are moved to vote, turn up at a polling station and discover that they don't actually have the franchise. And that's always something I think you want to avoid in any electoral process, and something as important as this referendum. We need to go the extra mile, I think, to avoid it.
We've been interested in asking about a detailed development plan by the Electoral Commission and the way in which it rolls out, and they told us last week that would be, some time yet. Are you concerned that people know the difference between the general information side of their role and your job to provide information for your campaigns?
Well, I myself have spoken at over 20 public meetings since the beginning of the year. And although, obviously, when I'm speaking, I'm trying to get a positive message across for the Yes campaign, there's also always a question and answer session after the speakers, and people in the audience are sometimes asking questions about the technicalities and, the voting procedure, etc. And so I think that there is an educational element in the meetings that we are already having, and the length and breadth of Scotland, from Stornoway to Stirling, from Dunoon to Dunfermline, and people are, and it's not just preaching to the converted, people are coming along, and I think that we, apart from getting our message across, I think we're helping to raise public awareness at this stage of the importance for the referendum and the procedure for holding it.
I think the other point that Blair makes, which is a very relevant point, which is that we must make sure that everybody's on the electoral roll, and especially when we're dealing with younger people as well, that we make sure that the Electoral Commission are getting into schools and colleges and universities and people are getting on the roll. So I think that from now on, to try and encourage that and to try and encourage people to get on the roll is really something we all have a duty to make sure happens. Absolutely.
Just on the other side about information, the Electoral Commission made it clear in its recommendations that it felt that both the Scottish Government and the UK Government should have discussions about the process issues, which would occur following the referendum, and that indeed, the necessity to have this kind of information is a part of the whole process. Would you agree that these discussions ought to be taking place now?
I agreed with what John McCormack said in his evidence, I think, last week, and what you've just quoted back. My understanding is that those discussions are going on between the two governments at the moment. So,
I'm very much of the view that that should happen. I think the Electoral Commission, in their advice, their initial document earlier this year, were very clear that the two governments should make clear what the process follows, both a yes vote or a no vote, and that they felt that both governments, for instance, could outline the process to be followed without, in a sense, showing their hand or jeopardising their position in any negotiations that would follow a yes vote. So I think there's a great deal to be said for following the Electoral Commission's advice and for both governments to do that. And I hope what doesn't happen, I know what Blair says about discussions being underway, but if I can say that I think part of the campaigning strategy of the No campaign, of Better Together, has been to suggest that no form of agreement whatsoever will be possible between Scotland and the rest of the UK following a yes vote. So there is, if you like, there is almost a campaign preference for confusion. So that and I think that has been part of the explanation for the reluctance to talk about what the process would be following a yes vote. I think it's one of these areas where the two governments ought to be able to agree and ought to be able to outline in very clear terms, as the Electoral Commission have suggested, the process that would be followed.
Convener, the final point to Blair McDougall, you said you thought that these discussions were ongoing. Could you elaborate what these discussions are?
Well, I don't claim to speak for either the Scottish Government or the UK Government, but my understanding is that discussions are underway between the two governments on this. But I mean, to be clear, I mean, picking up what Blair Jenkins just said, I mean, John McCormack did say it's clear there will be no negotiations about the terms of independence before the referendum. He went on to say that clarity in how the terms of independence will be decided would help voters. So there is a difference between pre-negotiating the terms of independence and providing the kind of information the Electoral Commission has spoken about.
Rob.
Thank you.
Stuart Milne, I think you're a quick supplementary. Stuart Milne, do you have a supplementary in this area as well?
It wasn't on this, it's on something else.
Okay, I'll come back to you, but Stuart Maxwell.
Yeah, thanks. It's a very quick question. I was interested in Blair and Craig's, Blair McDougall and Craig Harrow's responses about the provision of information by the Electoral Commission. The Better Together campaign, in its response to the Electoral Commission, stated, and I quote, "We strongly feel that no taxpayers' money should be spent on an information campaign on the referendum." Have you changed your view on that then?
I think the context for that was a Scottish Government-led information campaign. So there has been suggestion that the Scottish Government would spend taxpayers' money on sending booklets and pamphlets setting out the case for independence to every household in Scotland. I think the reason our campaign exists and the Yes campaign exists is so that that sort of information, that sort of political information, is given to people by the campaigns and not funded out of taxpayers' pockets.
So you don't have any problem with the Electoral Commission providing unbiased information to voters about the process, etc.?
Yes, but I think that's not political information, is it? I think that's factual information about the process of voting and about the process for what happens post-referendum in terms of negotiations.
But I would call that an information campaign, would you not?
Yeah, but I think the context is pretty clear in our submission about what we're talking about. If it's not, then I'm happy to make clear that what we're talking about is the suggestion that's been made by the Scottish Government that they would send information to every household with the case for independence paid for by the taxpayers, in our view, is wrong.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now, Stuart McMillan, you wanted to raise issues to do with regulated periods. So if you want to ask your question about that, and then we'll go into that, and then I'm going to come to purge issues after that.
Okay, thank you. Earlier on this morning, both sides have indicated also that you do intend to apply for the designated status organisations as soon as possible. And Mr Jenkins, you were talking about a few moments ago regarding the television adverts, and you'd like to see more than two. So therefore, is there an argument to actually have, instead of a 16-week period for the regulated period, is there an argument to actually have that extended?
I think that it was made clear by the Electoral Commission when they were here, if that was the case, you would have to change the spending limits as well. And it's kind of unpicking things which we wouldn't recommend.
I think also there's it's a good point, and one which occurred to many of us at a fairly early stage, that the difficulty in having a longer regulated period is you get this overlap with the European elections next year, and for all sorts of reasons, and I would certainly have some sympathy from people working in my previous industry in broadcasting if they were simultaneously trying to factor in the two competing sets of demands and balance that out if we were already into the regulated period for the independence referendum. So I think while good arguments have been made about the length of that regulated period, I think we've ended up in the right place. So I don't have concern about the 16 weeks. I think we've settled on the right figure there.
Right. Okay, well, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, Patrick, I think you wanted to raise issues to do with purdah period.
Yes, thank you, Convener. And in a way, it leads on from the issues that you were discussing with Stuart Maxwell a moment ago about the role of governments in making a case for or against. Obviously, you know, those who've counted carefully will have noticed there's one government on each side of this debate. The bill and the Edinburgh Agreement suggest that the formal purdah period at which the government's machines have to become neutral and not issue publications or make statements to make a case for or against or to try and influence the outcome is 28 days. In relation to the Scottish Government, that's in the bill. In relation to the UK Government, it's in the Edinburgh Agreement. It's an undertaking that's been entered into. First of all, I'd like to ask whether both the campaigns are content with that general approach, and secondly, whether you're content with the 28-day period as the appropriate length of time, and do you accept that before then both governments will be advocating a case for or against independence?
My view on these things is slightly informed by someone who was a special advisor during purdah periods in government. I think in our submission to the Electoral Commission we set out a slight concern about a disconnect between the regulated period and the purdah period, if you like. And I guess that was just about it being a sort of slight messiness between the two. I think that my experience of purdah from sort of being on the inside is that actually the real sanction, the thing that actually makes you behave in an ethical manner is the court of public opinion and the increased scrutiny that comes from the media during that period. I think the annals of electoral history are not full of governments having fallen foul of purdah rules for a reason, and I think that the scrutiny that both from our campaigns but also from the media that both governments will be under during that period is the real thing that will keep people honest, if you like.
I think the other thing is that during a Scottish general election, there's no agreement. There is an agreement, but there's no statute in terms of Westminster having a purdah, but they do stick to it. So, I mean, you do have precedent in that as well.
That's an important point, though. The purdah for the Scottish government is laid down in the bill. So, assuming this bill is passed, it will become a statutory obligation, whereas the UK government's purdah period is simply an agreement in the Edinburgh Agreement, and maybe representations could be made to the UK government to introduce a statutory instrument or something to oblige them to stick by the purdah period in the same way as the Scottish government. It should apply equally to both sides.
And can I just check with Blair McDougall as well about the earlier comments about objecting to the idea of a Scottish government-funded information campaign? Presumably you would apply the same argument to a UK government-funded information campaign. The same rules should apply on both sides. And are you content that the same rules do apply on both sides?
Yes and yes.
Okay, thank you. One final point on this, which is the other difference between a purdah period for this referendum and a purdah period for an election is that in an election period there are no parliamentarians in the parliament that's being elected, and that's understandable. MSPs should not be able to go out campaigning saying I am your MSP, or using the resources of an office funded by the taxpayer to campaign in the election. It'll be for the parliaments to decide what rules might apply. Do you have views about the extent to which parliamentarians should or should not be able to use their public funds to campaign during the period of the run-up to the election?
I think both parliaments already have fairly clear rules about what constitutes sort of political campaigning within the use of expenses. I think this isn't a sort of new thing. I mean, we do have guidance on this every few years when it's dusted off every few years when there's an election. I think this is an issue that goes further than parliamentary staff as well. I think someone had mentioned to me yesterday that local government officials won't be politically restricted for the purposes of this referendum, for example, because there is no connection between this referendum and sort of who directly employs them, for example. So, but I think it's probably not one for the bill and not one for our campaigns, but clearly parliaments, councils, anyone who public bodies who oversee staff, sort of who touch the political sphere, if you like, will have to come up with guidance that's appropriate.
From my experience at Westminster and in the Scottish Parliament, the Westminster rules do appear to be a bit more flexible. So I have a slight concern, maybe even more than slight concern. And if the committee or the Scottish Government does decide to make representations to the UK Government about the PURDA being a statutory obligation, then perhaps we should ask the powers that be at Westminster too, through the Speaker perhaps, to ensure that during that period that Westminster MPs abide by a code of conduct very similar to that which operates here in the Scottish Parliament.
Thank you, Convener.
Tavish, I think you had some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Do both campaigns envisage their respective governments making announcements during the regulated period leading up to the start of PURDA?
I would imagine so, yes. I mean, the PURDA period itself is the only period that's regulated, and the business of government, both in Scotland and across the UK, will continue. Again, this comes back to what I said on the kind of the real sort of policing of PURDA being the court of public opinion. If suddenly there is a huge slew of announcements from either government in the weeks before, I don't think voters are daft. I think they'll understand what's going on, and I don't think the media are daft either.
I would broadly agree with that, but I mean, as a matter of fact, I have no idea what announcements the Scottish Government might or might not make in the period before we get into PURDA.
Well, you have the Deputy First Minister sitting on your advisory board.
But I don't. I'm not privy to announcements that government are going to make. I think that's
so there's no. So there's no. You've opened up a whole area I hadn't thought about, Mr. Jenkins. So there's no coordination between and the Yes campaign and the Scottish Government.
In relation to the independence campaign, yes. But I understood you to mean the kind of announcement that's not directly related to the independence campaign, but might, for instance, be intended to win public approval in other areas of policy. I thought that was the ground you're covering.
Well, I don't think there'll be anything announced during that summer which will have anything other than to do with the independence campaign. I don't think I'm that naive, Mr. Jenkins.
To clarify then, yes, there is a high degree of coordination with all participants in Yes Scotland in terms of...
No, I'm grateful for that. It's a very, very fair answer. Do either campaign think there's any argument in favour of extending the PURDA period so as to allow actually the freedom of the campaigns to make the case rather than for government to make the case, even, for example, to the extent that government should basically stop its pro campaigns once Parliament has risen in both of them places, London and in Edinburgh?
I think, as I said earlier, in our initial submission to the Electoral Commission, we were concerned about the disconnect between PURDA and the regulated period. That arose out of the initial Scottish Government suggested spending limits, which were about half of what the Electoral Commission eventually said they should be. And our fear was actually when you've got campaigns on the ground in that regulated period spending £1.5 million, the debate will feel quite well rounded. If it was half of what it was, our fear was that it wouldn't be. I think there is a messiness about the disconnect between PURDA and the regulated period. I guess the counter argument would be that the business of government has to continue throughout that 4-month period.
I think that's the point that would occur to me also, is that governments have other functions, and I think governments, whether in London or Edinburgh, will be no doubt busy with other matters through the summer period of next year. I haven't myself given any great thought to whether PURDA should be extended for the purposes of this referendum. I'm not sure I see a compelling case for it.
Well, my point is that once Parliament has risen, once both Parliaments have risen, as Mr Canavan will well know from both his experiences, then the ability of MPs or MSPs to hold the government account just ends because Parliament's not there. So governments can carry on making announcements out with Parliament during the rest of that summer period when, if I may say so, both Yes and Better Together are trying to make the campaign for their proposed positions on the independence. Is there not therefore an argument for saying that the purdah period should start when Parliament rises for the summer recess to allow the campaigns the space to make their arguments?
Well, I think that, I mean, you can't suspend government for a prolonged period of time.
I'm not arguing that. I'm asking they should stop making politically motivated statements and announcements during the summer, which is what they'll both do.
I think that would be very difficult.
No, I don't, Dennis. I think it would be very easy to do.
Impossible to implement. I mean, government ministers are politicians and they're asked at public meetings about all sorts of things. So to try and shut them up for a 16-week period or whatever would just be completely unrealistic, I think.
I wasn't arguing we should shut them up, because I don't think that would be, as you rightly say, possible. What I do think they shouldn't be able to do is use the trammels of government and taxpayers' money to campaign. And do you think they should?
I think that what is laid down in the bill of a purdah period of 28 days is sufficient to meet your concerns and mine.
Well, I think we'll agree to disagree on that one.
You think, and just to both sides, that given that both the Scottish Parliament and the House of Parliament in London rise at different times in recess, that would give different purdah periods? Would that not create some complexities? If we were to follow Tavish's suggestion that the purdah should go from the time that recess starts, given that both parliaments...
You've got a fairness in the 28 days for both sides, whereas, as you say, if it was from recess, it might be more difficult, and it could be argued it would be less than fair. But I think the 28 days is a compromise.
I think also it would seem to me, I mean, and perhaps I'm thinking journalistically here rather than politically, to make a distinction between any government announcement in that time which is politically motivated, as it were, towards the referendum and one which isn't, I think would be almost impossible to make.
I mean, notwithstanding my previous comments, Convener, that I think the thing that polices this is the external sort of scrutiny and pressure from the media and others. The other thing which shapes behaviour, again from my experience as special advisor during purdah periods, is the guidance that comes from the civil service on this, much in the same way that the guidance that comes from the Electoral Commission is in many ways as important as the legal framework that sits behind it.
Okay. I was going to say I don't sense any supplementaries, but I do now. One supplementary, and then I'm going to come to Annabel Goldie just for a sweep-up question at the end.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, go back to the issue of the imbalance in terms of the fact that further to the bill, the Scottish Government is subject to a statutory provision on purdah, whereas the UK Government is not, and the suggestion that has been made before and that Dennis Canavan made again this morning, that a statutory instrument could be laid at Westminster to deal with that imbalance. Could I just, for the sake of the record, clarify what the other side's, Blair McDougall and Craig Harrow's position on that is? Would you support an SI being laid at Westminster to guarantee the balance in the purdah obligations?
My again, not claiming to particularly speak for the UK Government, the UK Parliament, but I think the reason the existing sort of precedent and practice is there is that it is quite difficult to unpick at a UK level what the UK Government does, what is relevant to Scotland and what isn't in that period as a political announcement, because again the business of politics will continue. But I'll go back to what I said earlier on, which is I think the real sanction here is not law, it's actually public scrutiny.
It's just to clarify, because of course you know, I'm asking you the Better Together campaign, and you did make a submission on this point on the issue of purdah in your submission to the Commission. So I think it's a fair question to ask. You know, now the idea has been mooted of seeking to have a statutory instrument laid in the Westminster Parliament to impose a similar obligation to balance the purdah requirements on the UK Government. Do you support that in the No campaign?
But, Mr Young, you've already got the Edinburgh Agreement, and there has been debate around this table in terms of...
It's not a statutory provision.
Well, that's as may, but I mean, the fact is the UK Government has made it very clear that they will abide by the 28-day.
Mm-hmm. So you don't seem to support then a statutory instrument being laid at Westminster to ensure that there is, on a statutory footing, a balance on purdah? You don't seem to. I don't want to put words in your mouth,
no,
but you have had the
that's a
opportunity
matter
now
that you
3
as a
times.
committee may well take a view on.
Sorry, you don't.
I think that's a matter that you as a committee may want to take a view on.
But you don't have a view on that then?
I don't know.
As the representative of the Better Together campaign, you don't have a view.
I think that the UK government has made it very clear in terms of their position with the 28 days.
Right, and the other minor point, picking up on another issue that was raised on the parity of the Westminster allowances system and the Scottish Parliament system for MSPs versus MPs. Do you believe, again, Mr Canavan suggested that with his knowledge of both parliaments that, in fact, the Westminster system is a bit more flexible. Do you think at the moment there's a parity of systems? Would you support there being a parity on the issue of the referendum?
I think that similar standards should apply to both parliaments. I haven't sat down and laid the two previous pieces of guidance side by side. But given the uniqueness of this situation, I think both parliaments will have to look at the procedures and issue new guidance.
Okay.
We'll have to move on because we're getting very close to the need to wind this particular session up. Annabel, I think you're a sort of catch-all question at the end.
Thanks, Convener. One broad question. You've seen the bill. Is there anything in the bill that you think shouldn't be there? Is there anything missing from the bill you think should be there? And a specific question, there's obviously a very, as you described, Mr McDougall, a very stringent regulatory framework within the bill in terms of compliance and organisations. Are there any aspects of that that present you as the two potentially main organisations in this referendum campaign? Do they concern you in terms of, are the time limits reasonable for compliance of some of the obligations? So one broad question, one more specific.
Broadly, as I said earlier, broadly speaking, we think the bill's in pretty good shape, and that's sort of obviously has fallen slightly out of where the Electoral Commission reported. In terms of concerns that we have, the main one we have is how do you balance ensuring that genuine dummy organisations, if you like, aren't set up, with not creating slightly sort of odd situations where existing party activists who are leading cross-party campaigns, either nationally or locally, are not sort of artificially taking one hat off and putting another on. Given that the spending limits have been set for the political parties within a sort of envelope which was intended to give even footing to each side, but there's a concern there, but the Electoral Commission are actively working with us on that to make sure that sort of situation doesn't arise.
And the technical aspects of the compliance post-referendum, returns, audits, all the rest of it?
Yes, there's yes. I mean, broadly speaking,
time limits okay for you?
Yes.
I think I would agree, but I think what would be true to say in response to the general question is that this is an unprecedented electoral event, and in all our contacts with the Electoral Commission, I think they recognise that as well. I think the reality of this is beyond what is on the face of the bill and when it's enacted. I suspect that issues and the things around this will come up in the course of discussion over the next year, which the two campaigns and the Electoral Commission are just going to have to sort out. I'm not sure we've necessarily uncovered everything that might potentially come up as an issue for us between now and the referendum. And all one can say is that I believe both campaigns and everyone else concerned, we'd try in a very honest way to resolve anything that does come up. But we are, to some extent, as members of this committee will know, in uncharted territory with quite a lot of the things that we're discussing today.
Thank you very much. There's a number of areas, gentlemen, which we weren't able to cover today. We may write to you just to follow up to make sure we've got all the evidence that we require for record purposes. But in the meantime, can I thank Dennis Craig and the two Blairs for being so helpful in our session this morning. I'm very grateful to you all. Thank you very much.
I would like
Dennis, I'm sorry, I've moved on. I'll need to move on.
Okay.
And we suspend for at least 5 minutes to allow the table to be reorganised for the next session. Thank you. Okay, we're ready to begin the next session of the committee. Okay, can I first of all welcome the witnesses who are here for the round table discussion, and I intend to, and obviously we're here primarily for issues to do with the bill itself, but this will no doubt go into the wider issues about registration, access, information, etc. And I expect that to happen. And I'm not going to do this like a normal session. I'm going to try to let the conversation flow as best as we can round the table rather than going through specific questions. I just want to highlight some certain areas. That having been said, can I welcome the witnesses for the round table discussion? We've got Professor Aileen McHarg, who is the Professor of Public Law at the University of Strathclyde, Bill Scott, who is the Chief Executive of Inclusion Scotland, Colin Borland, who is the Head of External Affairs Scotland at the Federation of Small Businesses, Kyle Thornton, and MSYP, who is the Vice Chair of the Scottish Youth Parliament, Euan Page, the Parliamentary and Government Affairs Manager of the Equality and Human Rights Commission in Scotland, and John Downie, who is the Director of Public Affairs, Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations. And I should also give at this stage Stuart McMillan's apologies for those of you who might have been expecting. Stuart has a private engagement he needed to be at and couldn't be here for this particular session. The three things I mentioned at the beginning there, registration, access, information, I think we'll just start in these areas. And I know that we've had some evidence coming in from certainly some of the organisations around the table about the whole area of registration. And I'd just like to begin to harvest ideas about how better we can make sure that we can make as fulsome a register as we can possibly achieve before we get to the referendum. And I don't know who wants to kick that off in terms of a discussion. John Downie, how about I pick on you in terms of a way to begin this as a discussion? How do you think, how does SCVO think we can contribute better to the issue of registration?
We held a round table convener a few weeks ago. We invited both campaigns. We had academics there. It was actually chaired by Charlie Jeffrey from Edinburgh University. We had the Electoral Commission with third sector organisations. Dave Moxon from the STUC were there. And I think it was driven, and Willie Sullivan, who gave it to you last week, was there. And I think people's concern was that, last Scottish Parliament elections, we had just over 50% of the people voting. Local government elections, 39%. And if you take a constituency like Shettleston, only 37% voted in the Scottish Parliament elections and nearly 22% in the local government elections. So we have a real lot of our citizens who are disengaged from the democratic process, or disengaged from politics. And the purpose of the round table was about a better democracy. How do we get to engage people much better in the process? And there is a lot of interesting stuff happening. I mean, certainly last year, SCVO gave some SeedCon funding to So Say Scotland to run an event at the Gathering to get people together to discuss the future of Scotland. We've given some SeedCon funding this year to the Community Alliance, local people leading Angus Hardy's organisation, to help them set up about 20 community events they want to run in the autumn, because we feel it's a really important area of actually engaging people, because it's obvious they are disengaged. Now, part of that's the debate, part of it can be the media, but I think we need to make stronger efforts to engage those people. Now, part of it, it's not really about information and awareness at that time, it's actually engaging them on the processes, the issues that affect their communities. I think local people leading in they're calling it their Big Vote campaign, I think, had an interesting process they wanted to use in terms of it actually saying, get a community together so they can decide what the issues they want to talk about and say to the campaigns, this is the issue we want you to talk about, not come in and give us a political speech. But I think we need to do much more of that, and certainly the discussions we've had with the STUC, I think both of us feel as if both the UK and Scottish governments need to be looking at a way of how they can facilitate this process. Now, that may be setting up a fund that organisations, community organisations, can get access to set up a series of discussions. We've got plenty of really strong local organisations who could be leading on this, but if we don't make an effort now, the referendum turnout could potentially not be as high as people think. And I think we need to look at it, because we've got the referendum, European elections, referendum, UK elections and Scottish Parliament elections. We've got to think of this in a longer term, or medium to longer term voting engagement process, because people are turned off and how we reach them. I mean, I'm going tomorrow to a session of the Poverty and Truth Commission. So you have a whole section of people there who are very active in their community, but they're disengaged from the political process in a sense. And it's those people who care and concerned and want to change things that we need to engage. And we think letting organisations, as I mentioned, local people leading, there's many others, that actually those are the type of organisations we could facilitate to do something about this. It's not about big national organisations, but it would have to be overseen, and it's a neutral way. It's about the debate and it's about engagement, and I think we can facilitate ways of doing that, but we need to start now. Bill?
I very much agree with John. I think that there's serious disengagement by a lot of people in our most deprived communities, and particular marginalised groups like disabled people, etc. There was actually good work done by a project funded by Scottish Government Equality Unit called the Civic Participation Network, and they actually evolved a toolkit called Talk for Scotland. Now, it was designed with the needs of those with communication impairments taken into account, but the actual toolkit is for use by any community to actually gather round and talk about what the real issues are for them, and, as John says, and then take that to the decision makers, etc., to the politicians, the campaigns, and actually say, these are the issues that we're really concerned about. Come and speak to us about that. And they then set their own parameters. And a lot of people living in our most deprived communities may not have a communication impairment, but lots of them, it's been shown through survey work by Scottish Government, have communication difficulties. And we are very much in favour of good written material and easy read, etc. It's easy to understand, but you need to engage with the person before they'll even read it. You need to get engaged their interest because you and I know any number of leaflets can drop through your door, but you actually need to have an interest before you pick it up and then look at it and say, what does this mean to me? And if you do this work, it's about active participation and drawing people into the process rather than just allowing things to flow and hope on the day that people will turn up. And I think there really could be a lot of good work done by local authorities, community learning and development workers, and by the third sector around about this issue to try and increase voter engagement, as John says, for all the elections that are coming up. But I acknowledge, and I think most people acknowledge, this is probably the most important political decision that people are going to make in their lifetimes. So try and get it right for this one, and then it will have knock-on positive effects in future elections as well.
Kyle, I think you want to contribute.
I mean, I think the referendum itself has generated a lot of debate, and I think people who ordinarily aren't interested in politics, certainly in my, as a member of the Scottish Youth Parliament, young people, a lot of young people aren't that interested in party politics, but the referendum has, sparked a little bit of thought, a little bit of debate. My biggest worry is, in terms of information awareness raising, is that people aren't registered to vote and they turn up on the day thinking they can go in and cast their vote and they find out that they're not on the electoral register. I mean, that's a real worry because a lot of people who I think have never voted before or who have rarely voted are going to turn out in this election, especially amongst young people, and with 16 and 17-year-olds voting within the referendum. I think we need to make a big push, not just from the Electoral Commission, but also utilising the third sector to really raise awareness around registering to vote, the process of voting, because I think we can do as many debates and we can really raise the profile. I mean, for me personally, I think it's for the campaigns, I think, to be making the case, and it's for the third sector really just to help provide the forum for that debate. It's for the third sector to help provide that access. For the Scottish Youth Parliament, we can help gather young people together, we can help mediate a debate between the two sides. They can make their arguments, but ultimately all of that work can be undermined simply on the day by people turning up, not being able to vote. And I think especially for young people, as a group who don't ordinarily vote, I think young people really need to be educated, and I think in schools as well. I think that's a really important one, they need to, you know, be educated around the process of registering to vote and, you know, around rolling registration as well, just so that they know that if they haven't registered before, you know, what's the deadline for them submitting their form to the electoral office to get in that register. And then that means that all of the good work around debate can actually be actioned at the ballot box.
We're going to let John in as well, but can we just bore down a bit more on the registration issue as well, about the ideas about how, because Kyle's began to flesh some of that out, about how we can get better at registration and increase that percentage. I think that would be quite a useful area to go in. John, I don't know if that's where you were going anyway,
well,
but
I think partly, and it follows Bill's point, because actually I think what we need to see here is a kind of a bottom-up approach to this, not a top-down from, you know, governments and the campaigns. I mean, certainly speaking to both campaigns, they seem to be on board and want to participate. I think in our briefing we used the example of the kind of active citizens campaign that was run in Ireland to increase, you know, voter registration. There's lots of other good ideas out there, convener, that actually be done. But as Bill said, it's actually we need, you know, trusted local organisations, well-established community organisations who we need to, in effect, fund the, you know, resource to get out and actually engage people on this issue, because this is about local issues, the issues people are concerned about in their community, which is getting them active. And obviously both Bill and myself are seeing this at the moment in terms of the, you know, the whole welfare debate. And we know how hard it's been to actually reach people and get to talk to them about the changes they may be potentially being affected by, because a lot of people are putting their head in the sand about potential changes, and it's been difficult for statutory agencies to engage with people on that. So there are lessons there. I mean, the Partnership Bill and other third sector organisations have with West Lothian Council on this is a good example of how you can actually reach and engage with people on the issue if everybody's working together.
And I just want to check in, Aileen, do you want to?
I suppose just to say that I think the issues around about registration and turnout, although they are connected, they're not the same, and that the lack of engagement is only one reason why people might not be registered. So I think that the registration issue is a much more localised issue to particular groups of voters, and therefore whatever strategy you adopt needs to be one that is targeted on the particular circumstances of those groups of voters. So young voters, the issue there is one of knowledge primarily, because they don't normally get to vote in elections. And I would have thought that's relatively easy to deal with through awareness campaigns in schools. For deprived communities, there are all sorts of other reasons why people don't register, around about, you know, fear of being on the register and the publicity that comes with that. So I think that's a much more difficult issue to address and requires different sets of strategies. What those might be, though, I don't know.
They also want to contribute to this bit of the discussion? Can I ask a specific of Bill then in that case, because some of the stuff you had in your submission about easy to read BSL issues, do you want to expand on some of that, because that also leads into the whole issue of registration and encouragement for people to actually go and vote as well?
Yeah, certainly, you know, particular impairment groups do have difficulties engaging with the electoral process because the information about it isn't in a format that they can readily understand. Easy Read in particular is a really good way of communicating with the whole of the electorate, because again, Easy Read has been designed for people with learning impairments, but it actually works very well with people with low literacy levels, and we know that we have a large section of the population with poorer literacy than we would like. So, and they live in the most deprived communities. They tend to be in low-paid work if they're in work at all. So, again, to reach them with the correct information that they need to understand what is happening, you need to render it in a format that they can readily grasp. And that means symbols and pictures and, you know, an easy-to-follow process. Now, I think it's a lot easier with a two-question, you know, sorry, I'll not get into politics of the questions, but essentially you're going one way or the other on this vote. You can follow that a lot easier. I do think, you know, the idea of getting people together, though, is really, really important, because you can then begin to tackle some of the mythology around about non-registration, because a lot of that started with the community charge and poll tax, etc. And it's not really relevant anymore, but people have got into a habit of doing it. And we do need to get through to people, and the best way of doing that is word of mouth, and that is local events. One of our member organisations, Glasgow Disability Alliance, held an event within, I think, about 5 or 6 weeks ago on the referendum. Both campaigns were represented and spoke at it, etc. 300 odd disabled people turned up to that. It's not lack of interest. If you can say, this is what's happening, this is why you should be there, and hear the issues firsthand, you can stir up the interest. And people then get a better handle on why this is important to their lives. Because I think that is the main thing about the whole referendum. It has to be made real to those people in the deprived communities that have disengaged with the political process. And that includes a lot of disabled people, because they're more likely to live in social housing, they're more likely to be living in deprived areas. So, I'm saying it for disabled people, but I've worked in deprived communities just about my whole adult working life, and they need to know what this means to their everyday lives, to make it real for them and to be involved. And once you engage their interest, then they'll take the steps to vote, to register, and then they'll be able to vote in the day. I think it's a good thing in many ways that people are going to be able to individually register to vote, because it used to rely on the head of household. So there could be potentially problems where 16, 17-year-olds weren't registered simply because the head of household didn't register, and therefore none of the people in the house were registered. Hopefully with individual registration, some of those difficulties can be overcome.
Tricia. Yeah, I was really interested in what Bill was saying about easy read, and you did give us some examples here, but I wondered if you could perhaps expand a little bit on how that would look, I suppose, in terms of a registration form. Sorry, I'm not asking you to be very specific about the actual text.
I'm not a specialist.
But just in general terms, how it would be different, I suppose, from the forms that are available just now.
It would be image heavy and text light. And just the way that the text and the imagery is aligned helps people follow through a flow of information process, which otherwise can be quite difficult for somebody with a learning impairment or literacy difficulties, so that they can follow in an easy stage process. This is what I'm doing. So it can be really, really helpful to people with low literacy levels and learning impairments, because as I say, the more text, the more chance that the person will begin to become confused about what they're meant to be doing, and the confusion, lack of confidence, disengagement again, because people don't like to feel, well, I might make a mistake in doing this, so I'm not going to risk doing it at all. I don't want to look a fool in public going into a polling station and not knowing what to do. So yes, they can ask for help, but they don't want to be the person that has to ask for help. They want to be able to maybe look up at something on the wall and go, right, that's what I'm doing. And some of that has begun to happen, but I think there needs to be more done by the campaigns as well as by the Electoral Commission, etc., to actually make sure that the information is there and it's easy to follow what people are doing in the process.
Can I just ask, Convener, would you then make all your registration forms in that format?
That would be the ideal, actually. And then if you had other information that you needed to see or wanted to see, then maybe somewhere where you could find that, rather than and having all this involved, references to legislative processes, etc., on that particular forum, have it somewhere else. Yeah.
Very helpful.
Tavish. Yeah, I was just going to ask a question if I could. Bill kind of touched on it there, and forgive me if this is a really stupid question, but I've always been struck about taking voting for granted in terms of the polling station and voting itself. You go into a strange little box and someone gives you a piece of paper and it all seems kind of bizarre if you think about it from first principles. is there a role for our returning officers, for local authorities to do work with the groups you're describing to make that whole process better, easier, more comfortable?
Yeah, I think there is. We ran an event with Electoral Reform Society and local registration officers working for local authorities and disabled people to actually look at what some of the remaining barriers were. And there was really good engagement, and I think that the registration officers, all in their evaluations, said it'd been really, really useful for them to hear firsthand what the barriers were, rather than what they thought they were. And that's always a real issue, because people have they think once the physical barriers have been removed, that's really the end of the access issues. That you can get a wheelchair into the building, that's it, end of the problem really. And what the disabled people there, because of the range of impairments, were saying is, sometimes it's difficult to follow the information that's there. So, could there not be more done about that? Or, I've got a visual impairment. I couldn't physically use the ballot paper because it was too small for me to see where I should place my cross. And when I ask for assistance, I'm then told you can't have it. Yes. Whereas, strangely enough, somebody with a physical impairment that prevented the use of their hands is allowed to nominate somebody to place their cross on the ballot paper, whereas somebody with a visual impairment that literally can't see where to place their cross isn't allowed to get that help. So there is an anomaly there, I think, needs to be addressed as well. That we're getting into the voting process rather than registration.
Quite a list of folk here now from politicians who want to come in, so I'm going to try and break it up as much as I can. If others who are not politicians want to join in, please, I'm encouraging you to indicate to me. John, though, I think you wanted to...
I think it picks up on Tavish's point. If you take the Scottish Youth Parliament, we've got young people at college, university, a group that is particularly disengaged, and this is more about their future. And we actually have to think about the way they communicate, they see things. And actually, I know we're not going to do it for this time, but we need to think more about, electronic vote and how we connect with people through mobile. I was struck by hearing the Chief Executive of the Scottish Court system when they were losing a lot of people not turning up for witnesses cases. So actually, witnesses get a text 2 days before they've got to turn up, and actually the increase in people coming. So there's lots of simple ways we can actually be thinking about, and how do we use the NUS in organisations? There's 48 students' unions in Scotland. How do we use all these organisations to engage young people and connect with them? There are ways we can do it, I think, but it is about the process, Tavish, because people just don't see it now.
I think I'll come to Kyle, because he's the less chronologically challenged of us all here to talk about this particular area.
Yeah, I think certainly in the future, and even at the moment in terms of our information campaigns, I think, for elections, very often it's all just thought it must be on paper, it must be on paper. In the name of fairness, we cannot put a thing online, we cannot do it electronically. And actually, for younger people, and again, for people with, difficulties in accessing, things on paper, doing it electronically would be a really good way. I think text, even if it's a text, the poll is this date, your local polling station is here. That can be as simple as just reminding someone to go along, to actually, turn up on the day. Because I think most people, do intend to vote, but when you talk to quite a lot of them who don't, they then say, oh, well, I just forgot, it wasn't top of their priority, their priorities in that day. But for this referendum, I think we really do need to, especially for young people, make a real push on voter information and engagement. Certainly for the Scottish Youth Parliament, we do it in our own work, in terms of making it more accessible, making things, less about, half-an-hour speeches from every candidate and, then sitting in a plenary for question and answer, and more about something, a bit more round table, something a bit more, quick-fire question and answer, just something that isn't as dry. And I think for young people, that can really engage them, especially on the issues in this, campaign that young people are concerned about. Because, out of any group in society, the decision that the country makes is going to affect young people for the longest amount of time. For us, you might think a question, such as pensions, that's not of concern to young people at all. When actually, if someone's saying, in 50 years pensions will be X here, well, actually, for young people, you know, that does begin to become an issue, because you are kind of thinking, well, that does factor in the decision later down the line, because I don't, you know, if we did vote, you know, to change our constitutional settlement, you know, it's not going to just be able to be reversed in 15 years' time. So the importance of this really does mean we need to focus on it. I think using, you know, especially say using the Electoral Commission and local electoral offices alone would be a mistake, especially for young people, because I think they don't do it very well at the moment anyway. They're not that great at encouraging young people to turn out in a normal election. I think, you know, the people who are already engaged with young people need support, guidance, whether that's support in terms of resources, you know, in terms of financial support, to actually get out there and engage with young people and do those face-to-face conversations.
One specific question on text, then, though. That would have to be an organisation like the Electoral Commission or the Electoral Management Board, perhaps, who would have to capture all these numbers. Would young people be comfortable with giving, or anybody, do you think, be comfortable with giving their text, their mobile number to effectively what would be, although not an organ of the state, act on behalf of the state?
I think for young people, it's not as much of an issue. I mean, most young people will give telephone numbers and email addresses on, you know, on electronic forms every single day. I think it becomes an issue. It becomes the issue. The less comfortable you are with technology, I think, is the way I would phrase it.
Okay, I'm not asking you any more questions like that. Colin.
Just a very quick point. Just there is a business angle to that as well, because the more that we use alternatives, the less that we have to go through the rather bizarre process of closing down primary schools and then making working parents have to make alternative arrangements for childcare, which we know is incredibly expensive. Then the knock-on effect that has on possibly their wage packet or indeed their employer. So I think from that point of view, I know we're not going to do it this time, but either moving towards smarter ways of voting or thinking about voting at the weekend was something that I think would have a measurable impact on business.
Okay. Annabel Goldie.
Two practical points, Convener, arising out of Inclusion Scotland's submission and Bill Scott's comments on that. The one is the physical access to polling stations. Now, it shouldn't be beyond the wit of man for local authorities to confirm how many of their polling stations don't have access for people with disabilities, because I think it would be helpful to Bill's cohort to know, well, that station is going to be used and it doesn't have access, and then the individual perhaps then can make alternative arrangements, proxy or whatever it may be. And I'm just wondering if there's not something we as a committee could do to help there, you know, because, as I say, it's not beyond the wit of man for the 32 local authorities to confirm which of their polling stations is unsuitable. And I think that something practical could then be done to anticipate that and to help. And the second one, and I learnt something I didn't know, and it was a comment that people who have visual impairments find polling station staff are under instructions not to assist them when they ask for help in casting their vote. And Bill, you enlarged upon that by saying that if someone has a physical disability, they apparently can get help. I was completely unaware of that. Is that the law?
Yeah.
Yes, because of the converse, if there was any attempt to interfere with the person's democratic secret.
But surely somebody can be at a polling office at a polling station. I mean, this isn't some maverick, wayward individual.
Right, Patricia, on you go.
I was just going to say people other than the polling clerk can do it.
That's right.
I don't think it's right necessarily, but I know, having taken an elderly person to the polls, I have to say about 20 years ago, long before I was personally involved in elections in that sense, and the polling clerk told me more or less to help the lady cast her vote. I have to say I was very disappointed with where she wanted me to put her cross, but that's another story. I abided by her wishes.
This plays directly into the legislation, obviously.
Absolutely right. I was just going to say Bill's absolutely right in what he says, and I've always thought that was an anomaly that shouldn't be allowed to continue unchallenged.
It's very frustrating for somebody with a visual impairment, because most polling stations now do display the large scale version of the ballot paper, and people actually go in and ask for it, get it, look at it, and say, right, and they go to make their cross, and the polling clerk will say, you can't actually use that. You have to use the standard size one. They say, well, I can't see where to place my cross on that, but I can on this, but I can't use it. So, there is a real problem, and it could be addressed by having a nominated individual who can assist you to cast your vote.
But would it be competent in this legislation to just make a one-off provision for that, for the referendum?
It's possible, but can I ask Bill, does he know why it hasn't happened before?
I'm not sure. I know there was a review of electoral arrangements in about 1999 or so that definitely allowed people to nominate someone who could accompany them to a polling station and assist them in voting if they had a physical impairment that prevented it. So no use of their hands or cerebral palsy, maybe not able to hold the pen, but it didn't apply to people with visual impairments because it literally had to be unable, to make a cross. Whereas, with a visual impairment, you're able to make the cross, but you can't see where to put it. so I think there is a bit of anomaly, and it hadn't really been taken into account. Yeah.
Rob Gibbison, I think you want specifically in this.
There's a lot of ironic laughter when it was talked about the necessity to have materials that people can use in the polling place, indeed in the awareness raising thing. We've been discussing with the Electoral Commission how they test out material, and indeed we are looking for them to do more of that in different languages and different formats. So you talk about Easy Read, and then you laughed. Now, if they're to use Easy Read in the various processes of awareness and through from that to the polling place, would you think that we should insist in this bill on having that range of material available?
Sorry, page 5820. Apologies, Rob, I'm getting carried away with the legislation in front of me here.
Well, we all get carried away with legislation. We're looking for the Electoral Commission to actually provide testing of materials, such as Bill Scott said, and that indeed in their detailed development plan, that they actually do include that, because they haven't as yet said when that will kick in, or indeed made any indication to us about these kinds of matters.
Would that be helpful, Bill?
I think it definitely would, and it would be an opportunity for the Electoral Commission to actually test run their materials with the people that you'll know best whether they'll actually work or not. There are specialists who can assist them in devising easy read formats and without losing the information that people really need to go through the process.
We host the Scottish Accessibility Forum, actually, and funny, we're doing our own website at the moment, and the advice from them has been invaluable on how you think about making it accessible. So I think the issue there, I think convener as well, the Electoral Commission's got a very strict remit, and the discussions we had at a round table with them is, their big thing is people, I think, as the Professor said, need a hook to vote, and it's that reason Bill was talking about earlier. If we're going to engage people, what is the reason? This is the reasons you need to vote. How then you're going to register and how to vote are the kind of technical aspects, but the bigger, broader issue, I think, that all the political parties, the campaigns, and the Parliament needs to address is, how do we actually get people engaged in the process, which is the much more difficult issue. We can talk about electronic voting Saturdays, and I think there is a case for a broader look at our whole electoral processes and how we actually do it from the technical, but I think the key issue is actually, how do we have a multifaceted capacity building campaign, if I can put it in inverted commas, that actually engages people through trusted community organisations, because it's actually about the technical stuff. I think we could solve. It should be the easy part, but actually it's the engaging of people.
I take that point, but just before we move on from and not lose the other issue about the anomaly, it does appear in section 22, is it? Paragraph 22 of Schedule 3, that on application a voter who is incapacitated by blindness or disability can seek help from the presiding officer. So, Bill, you might want to go look at that. And the presiding officer must, in the presence of any polling agent, cause the voters' vote to be marked. So
there's obviously the difficulty that people can be visually impaired but short of blindness. I know several colleagues in the disability movement who need size 18 font to make it intelligible to them, but aren't registered as blind.
It might be useful if you were to suggest us how the legislation might be improved specifically to try to deal with that anomaly. Sorry, John, I don't want to lose your point. I think Kyle wanted back in there, and then I'll come to Stuart Maxwell, I think it is.
It was just to say that I completely agree with John. I mean, I think we can get registration right, we can get people on a register, you know, if you can get the process right, but without the debate, you know, people might decide actually they're just not going to bother turning up to vote. And I think, you know, especially with the campaigns, you know, and the campaigns in young people, you know, at the moment young people seem to be getting bandied about by both campaigns. I think we seem to see news stories in the press where young person X says this and then the other campaign hits back with young person Y says that. And I think what we need is, you know, community-led, you know, things at a local level in schools, youth clubs, you know, in colleges, universities, even, you know, things also to target young people who are in work or who are not in education, employment or training as well. You know, things that can bring them to us actually, you know, just have a chat about the issues. You know, and I'm sure the campaigns would probably be happy, you know, to engage in that process because again, it's a benefit for them and that they get to reach groups which they find it hard to reach anyway. And the benefit for, you know, everyone else is they actually get to hear about the issues. But I think, you know, we really do need to make sure that, you know, that specific groups are targeted, you know, groups who are going to find it harder to engage in this debate because a lot of it is, you know, quite high level at the moment. A lot of it in the media is very, very detailed and a lot of people, for them, it just goes over their heads because they're either interested or they do find it genuinely difficult to engage with the issue.
Stuart Maxwell.
Thanks. For a point, I understand what's been said about, you know, making it easy to vote and electronic vote and all that, but I'm far from convinced that, you know, we're anywhere near ready for electronic voting for a whole raft of reasons, not least security. So I wouldn't support that. And as far as Saturday voting is concerned, there's a whole group of people who, frankly, would object most strongly to Saturday voting for religious reasons, and I think so. It's not an easy shift to make, although it seems easy on the surface. My point was really, or my question is really, has there been any engagement yet with any of the groups around this table, with the Electoral Commission or Electoral Management Boards, raising these very points about registration and about disabilities and about young voters and all the other stuff? Have the groups actually had that engagement yet, or do they know, are there any plans yet to meet with these organisations?
I'm going to start with Euan here on this question, I think, because he's obviously an organisation and Euan's had the chance to contribute. So, Euan, I don't know where your organisation stands in regard to the Electoral Commission.
We do have a contact with the Electoral Commission. We have in the past some of our legacy bodies, the Disability Rights Commission, worked quite closely with the Electoral Commission and organisations like Capability in the last decade to learn lessons about improving accessibility in polling stations. So there's an ongoing dialogue there. The Electoral Commission is the regulatory body with prime responsibility around equality and access issues with regards to elections rather than ourselves. So there's an ongoing dialogue there, but we've not had a sustained conversation thus far. But I think that's something that we will be looking to do down the line.
Anybody else want to got an experience with the Electoral Commission want to tell us about, or have you been engaged? John?
We certainly brought them along to a round table, and we generally tend to engage with them before all elections, because I mean a lot of third sector organisations, including ourselves, are producing manifestos, and while we're not advocating one political party or another, we certainly always talk to them about what they're saying to people in terms of guidelines, and this is no different. I think it's very clear, and obviously the third sector has had Oscar putting out some proposed guidance as well in terms of what people can or can't say, so that there's a fairly wide debate about that in the sector at the moment.
We've got sorry, on you go.
We have been in the past, but not in the recent past, so not around the referendum, certainly, but we did work with Leonard Cheshire Disability. In the past, they had a Citizenship Academy that had been funded through the Electoral Commission to actually increase or help increase voter registration amongst disabled people. So we did quite a bit of joint partnership work on that around about European elections, particularly, but not of late. No.
Okay, Annabelle.
Yes, Thank you, Convener. Just going back to the very important issue raised by Annabel Goldie about access to polling places, polling stations on the part of disabled people. I mean, I would have thought in terms of the Equality Act that there's a requirement on local authorities to ensure that there's access. It's not just a kind of, well, we'll try our best efforts. It's a requirement, I would have thought, as a matter of law. And maybe, I would, because we've got two experts here, Professor McHarg and Euan Page, if they could maybe comment on that, because I think we're moving on here. It's no longer simply sufficient to try your best. You've got to ensure that people can access your premises.
You want to go that first, Euan, and then I'll come to Aileen?
Sure. Well, this is a slightly anomalous area in that the reserved statute, which is the regulatory responsibility of the Electoral Commission, takes precedence over our role in the Equality Act in this. But similar provisions are there, and the Electoral Commission has order-making powers around identifying and requiring improvement to accessibility where barriers are identified, and that we do keep in touch on that. So yes, there is a statutory obligation, but it's also, I think, blindingly common sense that returning officers and local authorities, when they're looking at where the location of polling stations, don't just put it at Joe Blogg's primary school, because that's where it's been for the last 50 years. If there is a better alternative up the road, then it makes sense to use that. So it's making sure that people are aware both of the legal requirements, but also asking the right questions about, are we just going to have it in this primary school because that's where we've always used.
Can I say that, as far as we know, there are very, very few now remaining polling stations that are not fully accessible, but there were still a few in 2009 or so, mainly in remote rural areas, and where there obviously weren't easy alternatives. But I think a lot of communities have now got accessible village halls, so we're going back to this thing about the traditional place that was used rather than maybe using a new resource that's in the same community but hasn't traditionally been used for polling. Might be. I
think that's an important point. We're looking at a picture of steady improvement around physical accessibility. So it is obviously still an issue, as Bill says, in some areas, but I think it's important not to lose sight of the wider questions around disengagement that many of our contributors this morning have picked up on. It's what do you do with the communities and individuals who are several steps removed from even thinking about accessing a polling station and getting them engaged in this debate.
Okay.
Thank you, Convener. I found this extremely interesting and enlightening, but I have to say that there's a big crossover here, obviously, between process, how you can access voting, etc., and the message, and whether you actually be bothered. And I think that's very important. And I think what we had earlier with the two organisations, Yes Scotland and Better Together, should probably have been sitting here listening to a lot of things that have been said as well, actually, in terms of, and maybe you will be having, I presume you will be having meetings with all the different people here, because there's, in reality, it's making people interested enough in the referendum and in the future result that's going to come out of that referendum, whichever one it is, that's actually going to be the biggest thing that's going to make people want to go out and vote and use the accessibilities which we hopefully will be able to press for from here. When it comes back, Kyle had been talking about registration issues and especially using rolling registration, etc. But then you have to get to the young people, as Kyle was generally talking about, and actually make them want to register in the first place. And I was just wondering if it would be all right to ask if, when it comes to that, the Electoral Commission, and I'm not having a go at anybody in any way whatsoever because it's a great organisation, but is their message, I don't want to use pejorative terms, is it jazzy enough for people to be interested in when they come along to speak to young groups, whether they're in schools or in youth clubs or wherever? Are they going hip? Aye, yeah. Sorry, Grandad. So are they really going to be interested enough to then actually listen, not just to why they should vote, but then pick up on the issues as well?
I think the Electoral Commission do try, but I think they need to make much more use of younger people, of young community champions. I would, members of the Scottish Youth Parliament are the example I would obviously use of young people totally neutral on this issue, who are able to, work with the Electoral Commission. And I think it's really important to work with them to present things in a more youth-friendly way. Now, whether that's they create, a 3-minute video animation, which they've done before and which have been very good for young people around, the process of voting, some of the, the official information that's given out, and, how to register. I think that would work really well. One of the big things that, I've noticed as a young voter with the Electoral Commission is their website's really good. You go in, you fill it out, it then asks you to print the form and post it off, which, for young people, and, certainly for myself, well, I thought, well, I'll just not bother. I'll wait until the annual canvass comes round and I'll just make sure I'm on there. And, this is an engaged young person who's thinking, well, I'll not bother printing it off. It's a whole process. I think the Electoral Commission themselves need to start discussing with, people in the sector, working with young people. Certainly in Stuart Maxwell's question earlier, I'm not aware that they've had any real discussions with us, as a body who are used to getting young people out to engage in a voting process. We work with 12 to 25-year-olds, and I think what they need to do really is start talking with young people directly, start getting together a group of young experts to help advise them on how they can best do it, especially with 16 and 17-year-olds.
I'm very conscious of time here because we've obviously got time constraints because we need to be completed by 11:40, and there may be some members who've got questions. And Tavish is already indicating that. But Patrick, and we'll see where we get to with your question, the area you're developing, but we're very tight now.
Just very briefly about the way in which the Commission and other organisations engage, whether that's with younger voters, with currently disenfranchised people who've not been voting, with particular groups in society, whether that's around disability or any other factor. Is there a danger that it ends up being a wee bit patronising? And that, if we try and dress the thing up as though it's a reality show, we end up just demeaning the whole process. This is a serious matter, and I think all of those groups are capable of understanding it as a serious matter and being approached as though they are, quite capable of engaging with it at that level. Is there a danger that we go down the kind of razzmatazz showbiz route a wee bit too much and end up with people feeling patronised?
Aileen, on the business of show business, how do you think we're dealing with
it? I'm stunned by that. There may be. I mean, I think there is an issue about trying to engage people in a serious way, which I think doesn't necessarily require jazzy videos and sort of gimmicks. But I do think there is an issue about people not being turned off by the way in which debate is being conducted at the moment. So I think it's trying to find ways of bringing people into the debate who wouldn't otherwise have been. And the kind of models that I've been hearing about are the sort of community engagement events, trying to get people together with neutral facilitators to discuss issues actually in a very serious and quite old-fashioned kind of manner. So I don't perceive that there's much show business attached to this, but I may be wrong about that.
John, you had quite a lot of evidence in your written material, so you can capture that quickly.
I think there is a role for the Electoral Commission about the factual stuff and what we're doing here, but actually I would agree with Professor that actually this is about engaging local people. And the big vote referendum roadshow I referred to earlier, I mean, they're working with local facilitators, local people to actually, that's the way to engage, because the best one in the world, the Electoral Commission, is a public body, and there's a trust issue and an engagement issue in how they do things. So I think that's where, for us, it's bottom-up, community-led, with expert organisations, you know, playing a role to provide their expertise around that. So, and that will be the help that organisations need.
I thought some of the evidence you gave us in your written submission from SCVO was very helpful in that regard, and thought-provoking to make people think about how differently we can do this. Euan, and then I'm going to have to close this particular engagement.
Just very quickly, I think it is very, very important that we avoid the patronising dad dancing at a disco scenario of trying to engage harder to agree. Yeah, I speak from experience. And as John says, this is a bottom-up process, and old-fashioned methods of engagement can be among the most effective. We held a very useful roundtable last week with civil society organisations, academics and others. And what came out is that if you want people to engage in a debate about the Constitution, the last thing you want to talk about is the Constitution. People are utterly disengaged from the language and arguments of high constitutional politics, as they are often from the language and concepts around human rights, for example. So you have to start with what actually exercises people around unresponsive, clunky, bureaucratic public services, the frustrations people feel about getting adequate services for their kid that needs additional support, what can be done around ensuring that their granny is able to stay in her own home rather than being put into residential care. And it's that disconnect between the grating perennial public policy challenges that wear people down and what actual difference will be made by different or the same constitutional levers that we need to start with.
It's quite a strong message in which to leave this particular conversation, actually. Thank you very much for coming along this morning, helping to stimulate some ideas, giving us food for thought. I think one of the things that will obviously flow from this is that government, the Electoral Commission, the Electoral Management Board, indeed the campaign groups, will no doubt pick up on this evidence, and I hope that what you've begun to say, that will increase the engagement with you from today in terms of where we can take this forward from these various groups. But in the meantime, can I thank you very much sincerely for coming and giving us your evidence today. And saying that, can I just quickly wrap up the meeting before we proceed to the next process. The next meeting scheduled for Thursday the 6th of June, when the committee will take stage 2 on the franchise bill. Members are reminded that the deadline for lodging amendments is noon on Monday the 3rd of June. The committee next and final evidence taking session on the referendum bill will be on the 13th of June, when the committee will hear from the Deputy First Minister. Thank you very much, folks, for coming today. No.